You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
So we've been learning that under certain situations, look, if it's the custom of the country, you have to feed your workers when they come onto your premises to work. If that's even to the extent of giving them dessert or sweetmeats or relish or whatever the sweet things that are mentioned in the Mishnahs. And that's according to the custom. But there are certain categories of workers who are entitled to eat, regardless of the local custom. They're entitled from the Torah to eat. And in order, the Mishnah is going to now go on and discuss these workers. But in order to understand where the Mishnah is coming from, because as usual, the Mishnah is incredibly compact. In order to understand where the Mishnah is coming from, we need to first look at a couple of verses from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. And we'll see that the Mishnah is going to play with the intersection of these two verses. The first one talks about someone just coming into a vineyard. Ki tavo b'kerem re'echa. You come into your neighbor's vineyard, and it's a vineyard, by the way. This is going to be really important. Ve'chalta anavim. You can eat grapes. The Mishnah will learn you can eat grapes in a vineyard. We're not going to eat anything else. Knafshecha sovecha. It's difficult to translate this. To the satisfaction of your soul. Maybe that's the best translation. You can eat as much as you want, basically. You can eat as much as you want. Ve'el kelecha lo titen. But you're not going to put anything into a basket or into a vessel. And the Mishnah is going to learn from this, by the way, that we seem to be talking about harvest time. We seem to be talking about a time when you are collecting for your employer to put into his vessel. And you can eat, but you can't put into your vessel. That's the first verse we're going to that the Mishnah will use. And the second refers to an animal. Very, very famous verse. Lo tachsom shor b'dishor. You can't muzzle an ox while it's threshing. So our first verse looked at essentially harvesting. The second verse talks about threshing, talks about effectively working on harvested food. And we're not going to muzzle the ox when it's threshing. And the Mishnah is going to essentially combine both of these verses. Anything that applies to an ox, we're going to apply to a human. So in other words, the ox isn't going to be muzzled while it's working on the corn, but neither is the human. In other words, if you are a worker working on your threshing, you don't muzzle him either. And similarly, we'll apply some of the idea, or we are going to try to apply some of the ideas about some of the restrictions on the ox to the worker who's coming into the vineyard. But let's jump into the Mishnah and it'll become clear. The Mishnah is poetic. Eilu ochlin min haTorah. We're in the second Mishnah of the 7th chapter. Eilu ochlin min haTorah. These can I eat by the law of the Torah. In other words, the verses mandate that they can eat. These are workers. Haoseh bi mechubar lakarka. Someone who works on food attached to the ground. Gosh, this is like picking the grapes which are attached to the ground. When the work is finished. In other words, we're at the point of the harvest. We're harvesting the grapes. They're ripe. They're ready to go. At that point, he can eat. That's the first category. The second category, uvutalush min hakarka. We can eat food detached from the ground. So this will be, for example, corn on the threshing floor. It's already been harvested. It's not on the ground anymore. It's been harvested. We can eat food that's been harvested, say, on the threshing floor. Ad shelo nigmara malachto, until its work is finished, i.e., while the threshing is going on, we can eat, but not after the threshing finishes. Uvdevar shegidu lav mina aretz, and only something which grows from the ground. Both of these verses refer to things that grow from the ground. So if you're a worker in a cheese factory or in a challah factory or in a butcher's shop, you can't just eat stuff from the shop. We're only talking about things which grow, about vegetables. And so having given these 3 points, someone who works on food attached, on food that's detached, and something which grows, the Mishnah, in its poetic way, is now going to reverse them. Ve'elu she'einan ochlin. These are the ones that don't eat. Well, it's just the mirror image. Ha'oseh b'mechubar lakarka b'sha'a she'einan gamar melacha. Someone who works on food attached to the ground before the work is finished. So this is not harvest time. You can't just wander around the field when it's not harvest time picking food. And on food detached from the ground, say food on the threshing floor, after the work is finished. So you can't just walk into the silo and take food from the silo. And something that does not grow from the soil, like, for example, the cheese factory or the butcher's shop or the challah bakery. Now, what about, let's just go back to this ox for a sec. This ox is working with 4 limbs. It's working with 4 limbs. And we've said we're going to learn essentially from the ox. We're going to somehow integrate the teaching of the ox and the human. Does the human have to be working with 4 limbs? That's the question that the Mishnah is now going to play with. Someone was working with his hands, but not with his feet. Maybe he's picking grapes. Maybe he was working with his feet and not with his hands. Difficult to figure how that would be, but maybe we could imagine it. Afilu al ktefo. Maybe he's working on his shoulder. Maybe he's carrying stuff backwards and forwards. Harei ze ochel. He can still eat. He can still eat. He doesn't have to be working with all 4 limbs like the oxes. And Rabbi Yossi is going to disagree, but Rabbi Yossi, the halacha does not go according to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yudah Omer, Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yudah, says, Ad she'aseh v'yadav u'v'raglav. Only if he works with both his hands and his feet. In other words, if he's behaving like an ox. And we don't have to behave like an ox. I mean, really interesting philosophical issues, you could say, come out of this. We're not like an ox. We don't behave like an ox. And the worker does not have to behave like an ox to have the right to eat. And what is extraordinary is that he can basically eat. Well, we saw the verse. He can eat as much as he likes. We saw the verse said, until your soul is satisfied. So we'll see there are some restrictions, but he can actually eat from the best part of the field if you want to. And we'll see. If someone was working with figs, he can't eat grapes. Remember that the verse was specific. You're coming into a vineyard, you can eat grapes. You go into a fig orchard, you can eat figs. You can only eat what is there. You essentially eat what you're working on. So, someone was working with figs. He shouldn't eat grapes. If he's working among grapes, he can't eat figs. But, and this is the big but that is great for the workers, aval moneh et atzmo ad shemagia limkom hayafot ve'yochal. He can restrain himself. He can hold himself back till he reaches the very best place. And then he can eat. He can eat from the very best part of the orchard. And we'll see when we look at the next Mishnah, he can actually eat an enormous value of food if he wants to, and the employer can't stop him. Now, ve'chulam lo amru ele b'sha'at gmar malacha. All this halacha, all these laws were only taught about working time. And we'll see that the rabbis are actually a little bit free on this one. They allow eating a little bit outside working time. Because aval mipnei hashev aveda la ba'alim, because of the principle of restoring lost property to the owner. What's the lost property here? Well, we're thinking about the time of the worker, the time of the worker belongs to the owner. And of course, the time spent eating is lost to the owner. So maybe if we could optimize the workers eating a little bit, we could give back a little bit of time to the employer. That's what we mean by restoring lost property to the owner. So we are going to let the workers eat a little bit outside harvest time. So the Mishnah continues, Amru. So they said, the rabbi said, Hapoalim ochlim b'halichatan me'aman la'aman. So workers can eat as they walk from one furrow to another. So they're not strictly speaking harvesting. So strictly speaking, they're not allowed to eat when they're harvesting. But in order to help their employer, we allow them to eat while walking from one furrow to the other, so they don't spend their actual harvest time eating. V'chaziratan min hagat, and also when they're coming back from the wine press. This might actually be somewhere where you are working with your feet. So you've been trampling the wine press with your feet. You've been working the wine press. It's helpful to the employer if, when you eat some grapes, you actually eat them when you're walking home rather than actually in the press. So we're going to let them do that. V'chamor ad shetehei poreket. And we're going to let a donkey eat while it's unloading. So we're going to have a final thought for the animals who are working for us too, that this donkey's unloading. So it's not actually treading the threshing floor. It's just unloading, and it's not carrying, it's standing there and unloading, but we are going to let it eat while it's unloading.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.